Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble podcast, the show that teams up with the planet's mightiest defenders to learn about the diverse species and landscapes that make our world so amazing. I am your host, Johnny Bloxham, and today we have a great episode in store, highlighting what can be achieved through international collaboration within conservation. Today's episode is all about the Scimitar Horned Oryx, and we've got a special guest who's an expert on these animals that have bounced back from the point of extinction. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Tania Gilbert. Tania, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. How's it going?
It's great, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. I'm glad you're doing so well, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. We're discussing quite a kind of a very important species in terms of conservation today in the Scimitar Horned Oryx, and I hope at the end of the conversation today, we're really going to inspire and motivate people who both A, already work in conservation, but B, are just kind of outside of conservation as to what can be achieved through hard work by determined people.
No, I'm very happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk about conservation. And it's lovely to talk about scimitars because it's such a positive, hopeful story. And in today's world, I think positive, hopeful stories are great. It's what we need.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And so to kick us off, could you tell us about the Scimitar Horned Oryx and why we are talking about them today?
Yeah, well, it's an arid adapted antelope. So it comes from the Sahel, so the shore that surrounds the Sahara Desert in Northern Africa. It used to have over 1 million individuals in the wild. They used to form massive herds during their sort of annual nomadic migrations following the rains across the steppe grasslands. And they dwindled in the wild. And in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they went extinct in the wild entirely. So it's an antelope that can survive up to sort of 10 months without drinking water. It finds its water all through its food. So it's a perfectly adapted arid land antelope. And they're stunning to look at. They're sort of these russet and white antelope. They've got these really graceful meter-long scimitar-shaped horns, which is how they've got their name. And they're remarkably, I wouldn't say easy to keep in zoos. They have been managed very well in zoos. So when they went extinct in the wild, they had already been an ex situ population had already been founded back in the 1960s. And there were a few earlier than that, but it was the 1960s when the population really got going. So when they went extinct in the wild, there was this global zoo population. And that means it's the species didn't go extinct entirely. And it gave options in terms of reestablishing scimitars back into their indigenous range.
Fantastic. And so from that insight and from what we know, kind of what is the future for Scimitar Horned Oryx looking like?
Do you know, I had a conversation with John Newby. He was a very eminent conservationist. He worked on scimitars in Niger and Chad back in the 1960s when he worked for WWF. And he's worked on their conservation consistently all the way through. And about 15 years ago, we had a conversation. And he said to me, I won't ever see scimitars back in the wild in my lifetime. You may, but it won't happen in my lifetime. And since 2016, when scimitars have been re-established back in the wild with the project that John's been involved in, I have taken great pleasure in reminding him of his pessimistic prediction that he would never see them back in the wild. And now we have about 200 scimitars in 4 different protected areas in Tunisia. They're in protected areas in Morocco. They've been re-established in an enclosure within Senegal. So they're sort of back in one of their range states. And in Chad, there's been a large-scale reintroduction to the Wadi Rimi Wadi Hakim faunal reserve. And there's over 600 oryx now free-ranging in Chad. So yes, I love reminding John that, you said we'd never see them back. And there they are. Your lifetime, your project, or a project he's been heavily involved in. And, it's really positive. So they were downlisted, which sounds really negative, and it's not. It's a brilliant thing. So they were downlisted on the IUCN Red List from extinct in the wild down to endangered. And it's momentous. It's absolutely phenomenal. And it's a real herald to all the sort of conservation endeavours that have been going on since the mid-1980s. And they're still threatened. You know, they're not out of the woods.
Yeah.
You know, they're still endangered. So they're still threatened with extinction. But having those populations back in Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, and Chad means that it's really positive. It's really hopeful. And, you know, they're encountering all the things that they would normally encounter, and the populations are growing. So it's lovely to talk about a good news story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose hopefully, you know, we're kind of wanting that to be a model for other species in a similar kind of scenario at the moment. But could you walk us through the process then of how we got the population from zoos back into the wild?
Yeah, so there's been a number of projects. So the first pilot project that took place was in 1985, and it took 10 Scimitar Horned Oryx from Marwell Wildlife, where I work, and Edinburgh Zoo, and it was a trial release. Nobody knew if it would work, and it was a project piloted by the Direction Générale de Forêt in Tunisia and Zoological Society of London, and released these 10 animals into Bouhedma National Park in Tunisia, and they were great. They got it. They fed on the right plants, they found water, they did very well, the population grew, and it was that sort of realization that we can reintroduce the species. So after that sort of trial release, in 1999, there were 2 further releases, one to Oued Dakouk Nature Reserve and one to Sidi Toui National Park, still both in Tunisia. And this time there was really careful selection, or more careful selection, of the oryx that were taken from the European ex situ program. And so they were chosen based on their genetic relatedness to each other. So the idea was to increase the genetic diversity, which is needed to ensure sort of sustainable populations and good responses to diseases and other environmental changes. And they were released into those 2 protected areas. And again, they did well. Sure. In the meantime, the Moroccans had taken a load of animals from sort of the EP, so the European ex situ program, from Germany mostly, and released them into Souss-Massa National Park. And again, they did great. It's an area which is more tightly managed. But again, it got the species back into the country that it originated from, and it has allowed them to carry their own reintroductions out. So it sort of grew from those. And then in 2007 was the first project that I was involved in. And we took animals from North America, so from their program, and from the European ex situ program, and we released them into Tromes National Park, so the 4th national park in Tunisia. And again, they've done great. We've been monitoring them ever since. We've been looking at the biodiversity and the habitat and what other species are around and predation and a whole bunch of stuff. Because after you reintroduce, you can't just walk away from a project. Mm-hmm. You need to carry on monitoring after they've been released. And that gives you really important information in terms of any management interventions that might be needed, or if you need to change anything on the project, and to see how it went. So that happened. And then back in 2012, the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi convened a big workshop, and they were looking for a large-scale reintroduction to have these animals free-ranging. So the animals that have been released into Morocco and Tunisia are within fence-protected areas or partially fence-protected areas. So they can't follow the rains over a very large landscape like they could ancestrally. Mm-hmm. So the project in Chad, so the Wadi Rime Wadi Akin Faunal Reserve was chosen because it's huge. It's absolutely massive. It's like a donut hole in the middle of Chad. So it's one of the largest national parks in or protected areas within Africa. Mm-hmm. And it has fantastic habitat. There are challenges there. There's always going to be challenges. We don't live in a world where, you know, if there were large tracts of land unaffected by people, then they wouldn't need conservation. Sure. So they convened a workshop there, and we all got together and we used data from the International Studbook to model what would happen if we released this many animals versus that many animals. And came up with a plan, and they implemented it with the Chad government. And it's been managed on the ground by Sahara Conservation, so a conservation charity that works over the whole of North Africa. And as I said, they've released a large number of oryx, the biggest number of oryx in any project. And they've now moved on translocating addax, which are critically endangered, so highly threatened with extinction. And they've also doing some work with Dama gazelle, which are also threatened. So being able to reintroduce the oryx there meant that they had the facilities and the means to help other wildlife as well. And as I said, the project's going great. They've had, I think they're on the 3rd or 4th generation by now.
Wow.
There's over 600 animals in the reserve. And, the success of these conservation projects is why it was reassessed by the Red List. So I've talked a lot, but it is a process that has involved zoos and agencies and governments and some fantastic individuals and people really going, yeah, it's tough, but we're going to give it our best shot. And I think everyone working together has achieved, a fantastic result.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, within that bigger collaborative effort, that in kind of different niches that are involved in that, so like you say, the zoos, the agencies, and the government. So now kind of that project has been established and maybe potential model for future ones. What other roles have zoos got to play in continuing Scimitar Horned Oryx conservation?
So, as I said before, just because they've been reintroduced, just because that's worked and they've been downlisted doesn't mean you can just walk away. And I think one of the things with conservation is that it's never really done. You don't tick a box, go job done, and that's it. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could? But, it's a changing and evolving world, and there's lots of different factors that come into play. So, zoos do still have a role. So, for instance, zoos from Europe and some in North America as well selected animals using the International Studbook and sent them over to Abu Dhabi in preparation for the reintroduction to Chad to genetically augment the source population. And again, the team at Wild Genes Laboratory up at Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and had looked at the genetics and said it needs more diversity, ideally, and which is why those animals went from the European and North American zoos over to Abu Dhabi. And we still have our mind on that going forward. So looking at places like Tunisia and Morocco and all of them, there is still genetic diversity within the ex situ populations that are not represented in reintroduction projects. Part of it could be that over time, gene diversity is lost just through a sort of natural drift process. Some of it is that all the original genetic diversity wasn't captured. But things like this do matter because it is that diversity which enables populations to evolve, to adapt, and it helps avoid things like inbreeding, which can have detrimental effects on a population. So there's potentially still a role for zoos to augment some of those projects to make sure that genetic diversity is transferred. There's also a lot of skills in zoos. The guys that I work with, the vets, the animal managers, the animal keepers, they're hugely talented, and their confidence and abilities are going to be really valuable on those projects. So sometimes it's a question of skills transfer, making sure that we can bring some of those guys across and, they can share their experience with the people who now work on the ground with those animals in sort of the range states, but also sort of wider scientific skills as well, and forming those collaborations and partnerships to make sure that, those released populations are as sustainable as possible, that do as well as possible. So there's a role in terms of funding, there's a role in terms still of animals, there's still a role in knowledge exchange. The work in Tunisia has been largely funded by zoos. There's multiple roles still for zoos to play in the sort of conservation story for scimitars.
Yeah, and the funding and knowledge transfer is a really interesting concept because when you talk about breeding programs, for example, on paper, the primary role of a breeding program is to have that genetic population that,
Mhm.
in the Scimitar Horned Oryx's case, can then be, used to supplement wild populations or reintroduce wild populations completely. Um, but now that that's kind of really doing well and taken off, um, how important would you say the breeding program for keeping a certain amount of scimitar horned oryx in reputable zoos for that knowledge transfer, so that the story of the scimitar horned oryx doesn't get lost?
I do think it's really important to keep telling those stories. And the scimitars are a great ambassador. They don't like it really cold and really wet, but actually they do pretty well in most European zoos. Um, so there is, having them there as a sort of an ambassador for the work that's happened can be hugely valuable, especially in sort of trying to inform the next generation using in education programs. But the population at the say the European ex situ population or the North American version, they're still really valuable. As I
Mhm.
said, there's still potential for bringing animals from those zoo populations into, Tunisia and other countries to augment the genetics. Because over time, if we don't do that, then the populations might dwindle to nothing simply because of inbreeding. And the European ex situ population and others are managed to maximize genetic diversity and
Yeah.
maintain demographic stability. So we know that more genetic diversity is retained in those programs than if they were just left to themselves. So they have quite a valuable role to play sort of across multiple areas. And I think the story is important. We've talked about sort of, reintroductions for golden lion tamarins have resulted in downlisting. The same has happened for Shavatsky horses and Arabian oryx. But some of these stories happened quite some time ago.
Hmm.
And this is a modern story. It was down, the scimitars were downlisted in December 2023, so only a few months ago. And it's work that is still ongoing now. And I think the fact that can still happen in an area of the world which is challenging, but in the modern era where we have so many competing demands on land use, that it's important to know that we can still do this. This is not a historical impact that we can have. It's a current modern impact that we can have. And again, we see it, sort of in sort of ongoing reintroductions in the UK. So the beaver reintroductions and things up in Scotland and down in Devon, they're going well. We're learning a lot from those things. And again, it's not without challenges. And
Hmm.
some of those challenges are, you know, difficult to overcome. But again, it's people working together to find solutions. But this is still a modern solution for our current world. And the scimitars are very much an up-to-date example of how we can still do effective conservation in a world when we're quite so challenged. And we know that, if there's oil, then, that often takes priority in a place. And, there's agriculture and all these competing land uses. But we can still do it. We can still make a difference. And I think that's a really important story.
And actually, just to take it back then, because we're now talking about how they've been downlisted to endangered, which is great on paper, um, but there's still, there still is that risk of it going backwards. Hopefully, it won't. But yeah, compared to when they first went extinct in the wild, what are the threats the same? Are the threats different?
Some of the threats are the same. So there's still, competition with domestic livestock in some areas. In the fence protected areas, sort of north of the Sahara, that doesn't occur. But it does mean that the animals, when they do try and leave the parks, haven't got suitable habitat outside it. So they're sort of on large habitat islands, but still
Yeah.
sort of quite large habitat islands. But sort of south of the Sahara, yes, some of those threats are the same. We've seen an increase in insecurity. So, and sort of human trafficking and, illegal arms and various other things through Northern African routes have changed. So that's brought additional challenges. One of the things that did used to occur and was a threat, but has become more prevalent is wildfire.
Right.
So, and the wildfire is, spreading in a slightly different way than it did previously. So there have been sort of large-scale bushfires in the Wadi Rum and Wadi Hakim Faunal Reserve, to the point where some fire breaks have been cut to try and minimise the impact. And under climate change scenarios, different models suggest different things for the Sahara. Some suggest a greening of some areas, which may increase competition between domestic livestock and wildlife. Others show desertification. So the models are quite complex, and there's the Great Green Wall that's sort of being developed across the sort of Sahel region as well. So there are some of those threats are the same. The projects, when it was implemented, are aware of those and have a responsibility to try and mitigate against those threats. So, drought has been a threat in the past, especially if you have a number of consecutive years of drought.
Yeah.
Whilst the oryx can cope with short-term drought without too many worries, when it's long-term, it's problematic. And, that may become more prevalent as well. So again, sort of what mitigation measures can be put in place? What can be done to try and support those populations? So we have to sort of adapt our management strategies depending on the threats as they evolve. So yeah, some are the same, some have gone away, some new ones have emerged.
Different world from when they were first in their home territories compared to now.
Yeah, so if you think they went extinct in the world of the late 1980s, I don't think of that as being that long ago, but apparently it is.
I mean, it certainly isn't in the grand scheme of things, but I think obviously, we've definitely changed the land, or the planet has definitely changed in landscape in 40 years, hasn't it?
Exactly. And I think, 40 years is, think of all the just, changes that have taken place over that period. And so, yes, they are encountering a slightly different world. But so far, so good. And the projects are continuing. So as I said, it's not like the animals are being released and everyone's packed up and gone home. So the projects are continuing, and, that provides the ability to adapt and sort of implement mitigation measures to help reduce those threats as well.
And so, from that, taking the positives of this success is, how do you think we can apply the model for Scimitar Horned Oryx conservation to other species?
So I think there are lessons that can be learned. That having a transferable model is slightly difficult because each species have their own challenges. So some of the work that I've been doing has been with a task force associated with the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group of the IUCN, and we're looking at the recovery of extinct in the wild species. So there were, a number of species which are completely extinct in the wild, but held in ex situ institutions, whether that's botanic gardens, seed banks, or zoos and aquaria. And some of them are like Scimitar Horned Oryx. There was about 20,000 in ex situ institutions around the world, or still is. Whereas some species may have only 15 to 30 individuals left in the whole world. And so trying to apply the same principles between those two species is difficult. What it shows us is that we can recover those species. We know the Mauritius kestrel, increase their population from a single pair up to sort of 200 odd individuals. It's going to have a problem with genetic diversity. And how that pans out down the line is sort of unknown, but it does show the potential for species recovery. So I would say lessons can be transferred across, knowledge can be transferred across, but perhaps each species is going to need their own champion, their own approach. So yeah, it's lessons, I would say, rather than models.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's great to know that despite it's still not a them and us kind of thing. Despite certain people being specialists in arid antelope, for example, there's still something that they could contribute to a reptile or a bird further down the
Oh,
line.
absolutely. I mean, some of it is sort of reasonably simple tech transfer. How do we keep track of animals once they've been released into the wild? We've carried out some reintroductions for sand lizards, so small British lizard. Really difficult to find after you've released them. They're really cryptic. We work with some great ecologists who have got their eye in for a lizard, but I can stand next to one and not spot it. So they're brilliantly camouflaged, and we tried transferring some of that tech. So using radio tracking little backpacks for the lizards that would track them for the first couple of weeks. What we discovered there was that there was no greater advantage in doing that than having a good ecologist who's able to spot them. But again, looking at those different methods of, can we transfer the technology? What kind of information do we need? And I think it's something that's shared quite frequently are things like disease risk assessments, social impact risk assessments. When somebody's carried out a particular piece of work and shares it, people go, oh, that's really useful to me. I can adapt that for myself. And so I think we see a lot of that sort of knowledge transfer between different projects, even if we're talking about a lizard versus an antelope.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, that's really great, and I think certainly as zookeepers go, everyone enjoys their work with the animals, but I'd say a lot of zookeepers really enjoy networking.
Yeah, and as I said, sharing that knowledge. I mean, we've had, one of our started at the beginning a senior keeper and then sort of moved up, but he's been involved in the introductions in Tunisia and taking the animals over to Abu Dhabi, and again sharing that knowledge that he has in looking after that species with the people who are now going to be looking after it, and the opportunity to sort of learn from them as well. And that sort of as you say, networking, that interaction, that ability to share some of the phenomenal knowledge that the people who work with the animals every day have to actually improve their conservation is sometimes underappreciated, but it's really valuable.
Yeah, and quite often, a huge motivator as well. Like you say, when it's difficult to kind of remember the positives in your everyday kind of working regime, to have that fresh motivation from such an interaction, and can work wonders.
Yeah, and to know that they're contributing towards something really valuable. I mean, no, when we transferred the Scimitar Horned Oryx to Abu Dhabi in 2014, I think it was, in preparation for genetically augmenting them, preparation for the release. Our keepers looked after the animals for 2 years as they sort of came into Marwell, and they cared for them and they looked after them. And then a couple of them sort of accompanied the animals over to Abu Dhabi. And, there was a sort of very visceral, very tangible impact that they could have. But recently, we've also been looking at the role of uncrewed aerial vehicles in wildlife monitoring. And so we've been conducting test flights over the zoo. And, again, looking at, first of all, the first thing was, would using drones impact on animals? Do they notice them? And again, having our animal keepers who are doing the welfare assessments whilst the initial trials were going on, being able to help us when we're looking to say, can we assess body condition using UAVs? Or can we only do it from the ground, or camera traps? And how can we transfer this to using it in the wild, where we can't get so close to the animals to determine what their health status is? So how can we use some of this technology, and does it work? And the guys there, they've been absolutely pivotal in making these things happen. So no, they're definitely as much of part of these projects as anyone else. They're really important.
Yeah, and actually, thank you, because that's a really great point of highlighting, certain elements of research, like you say, that zoos are such a great resource for.
Yeah, there's huge potential there, actually, and sometimes it's in something as simple as the data. So things like the international studbooks or regional studbooks, it's a compilation of the whole life history of the species since it was first brought in from the wild. And, it contains information on longevity and age-related reproductive rates and all these data that we need to be able to build population viability analysis models to determine which the best release strategy is. So that there's everyday data when someone goes, oh yes, that animal's been born, and they record it, and that data ends up in the stud book. And then being able to go, right, what do we know about the species? And when we first built those models, we didn't have a wild population to collect data from. So we had to build it on something, and we built it on the ex situ population and the stud book data. And then that helped us inform what we did in Tunisia back in 2007. It's helped inform what's happened in Chad. What is the best release strategy? How many animals should we be releasing based on population growth rates that are likely to happen afterwards? And so something as simple as just recording down a date accurately, or who the parents were, can actually, it sort of all comes together to lead into something which can be really influential. And the potential for research as well. I mean, the stories that are hidden in these data is phenomenal. And we can look at changes under ex situ care. We can look to see what is the potential for introduction. We can look at genetics and go, actually, we might need to look at exchanging animals between different regions because the genetic diversity is too low. So there's a lot of research that can lead on to some really practical, impactful conservation work. So no, there's a huge potential there.
Yeah, so really thank you for kind of saying that, because it was not something that really kind of slipped into my mind. Thank you for giving us a kind of an insight into the story of the Scimitar Horned Oryx so far. And now we want to kind of learn about what Scimitar Horned Oryx mean to you personally, and about you, just learning about you in your career. So, yeah, what was your first experience with Scimitar Horned Oryx?
It was when I first started working at Marwell back in 2001. So I'd come from a background where I'd worked for one of the wildlife trusts and English Nature, as it was then, so Natural England, the government's statutory body for nature conservation in England. And I had done some conservation research in the past, and I wanted to move back into a research role. And that is the job I took at Marwell. And with it came managing the European ex situ population. And it was just one of those duties that was in there, and the European stud book, as it was at the time. And, I sat down, started figuring it out in the old DOS-based software that we used to use to manage the population back then. And, was the EP coordinator then for 16 years. And when we started looking at setting up, or the Direction General de Forêt in Tunisia asked us to set up a new reintroduction project in Tormes National Park, we looked at the data set because we wanted to take animals from North America and Europe, and went, the international stud book's not so up to date. Sure. We need a compiled data set where we can choose the best genetic match, the best demographic match, and release a population that's going to be sustainable. And I was young and naive and had no idea how much work was involved, and volunteered to take on the international stud book. And then I bought in the European stud book and merged them together. And from that, we carried on working the project. We had the data set, we chose the animals. There was some disease restrictions in the UK back in early 2007. So we had to change which animals we were choosing. And we had backup animals, we had a backup plan. It was all okay. And then sort of that reintroduction of taking the animals out to Tormes in 2007, of arriving late in the evening, checking on the animals and deciding to release them at dawn the next day. And I think it was sort of standing there in the park as those slides were pulled up and the animals came out into their acclimatization pens, and the look on the faces of the guards who were there, and they had their oryx back in their park for the first time, and they were back in their habitat where they were meant to be, and seeing them since, and these herds just roaming across the steppe grassland. it is phenomenal. It's so tangible, and so many things in this world aren't quite as tangible as that, but they weren't there and now they are. And then I did my PhD, or started doing my PhD on them. So they've been quite a large part of my life for quite a while. But I think the most interesting thing about them is the fact that, and this isn't to do them down at all, but the most interesting thing is the fact that they are a sort of a beacon for wider conservation work. So in order to reintroduce the scimitars, they had to have a functional habitat. So there was a lot of habitat restoration work done by the Tunisian authorities. And having them back means that there's good habitat then for Dorcas gazelle, and there's Barbary sheep in the mountains, and there's all these migratory and resident birds, and there's small mammals and gundis and striped hyena and African wolves, and it, you know, that area had been quite degraded habitat back in the 90s, and then the Tunisians decided they wanted oryx back there, and it's beautiful, it's stunning, you know, like the ephemeral riverbeds, the wadis that run from the mountains to the salt pan are sort of bursting with shrubs and flowers, and that's often where we lose the oryx, where we can't find them. They're all in these ephemeral riverbeds, but it's you know, it's a restored habitat, and you know, it was wanting the oryx back that enabled the Tunisians to do that. So I think that's sort of one of the biggest things about it. When we talk about reintroductions of megafauna particularly, it's often about a wider impact on conservation, not just reintroducing that particular species.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sure it's probably humbling when, yeah, you get one animal back, but you get so much more than you bargained for, and that's only going to continue as the project continues as well.
Yes, I think it is one of those things. It is that wider impact. It's, you know, a restored landscape. And, you know, we can see it in sort of different places. You know, people talk about rewilding these days. It's a very sort of popular term. And reintroductions are an important part of rewilding, but it is that wider process of restoring functional ecosystems, restoring habitats. And sometimes that rewilding is stepping back and just letting the habitat restore itself. But often you'll then have to reintroduce the megafauna if they can't make their own way there.
Yeah.
And you know, the oryx couldn't make their own way there. So those projects are necessary, but I think that's it. It is seeing that sort of wider biodiversity impact.
So you mentioned kind of not necessarily wanting or having oryx in mind when you first started career. Could you, yeah, where did this love of conservation, or when did you know that you were going to get in conservation, that was a career goal?
Oh, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I love sharks. Still love a shark. Sharks are great.
Yeah, they are.
But I think it was, you know, David Attenborough and Jacques Cousteau. And it was the only time I'd bunk off school. I was such a... I like school. But it was, you know, it was seeing those programs of seeing, you know, David Attenborough and the Ngorongoro crater and Jacques Cousteau and, you know, sort of exploring the underwater worlds. It was just hugely inspiring. And so I decided, I know by the age of 12, that was it. I was, you know, that's what I wanted to do. And then I did an undergraduate degree in biology on the basis of, if I do biology, I can always specialize in marine later. But if I specialize in marine and I discover that I hate it, how do I go back? And these days I know that that's entirely possible, but back then. And after I finished my degree, I went out on a project to Tanzania to do biodiversity surveying. And I just fell in love with the mountains and the savannas and the forests, and that was it. And I think for me, though, it is this desire to do some good, to have an impact on conservation, to you know, try and help wildlife to sort of do that good in the world. So I didn't have a particular taxa or group in mind, and then I did a master's in conservation management and started working for a wildlife trust. And then it was, walking through sort of Surrey woodlands, which are very benign compared to some of the other woodlands in the world. But having a barn owl just fly in front of me through a clearing, and it just stopped me in the tracks. And just realizing just how phenomenal our own wildlife is. And the UK is a very nature depleted country, but we still do have some fantastic wildlife, and we have the potential to restore more wildlife as well. And then, as I said, going to work for English Nature, as it was then, it's Natural England now. And again, it's there. It was all habitat based. It was like looking after triple SIs, and I just got to spend my summers tromping around woods and meadows, and it was just, it was a lovely, peaceful existence. So I, always had this sort of inkling or yearning to get back into sort of a more conservation research. So when the role came up at Marwell, I applied for it, and I thought I'd stay a couple of years and move on. And that was 2001. I started working there. So that part of the plan didn't work. But I didn't have a particular taxa or a particular plan, or I just wanted to work in conservation. And so that's allowed me to explore different elements, different areas of it. And these days I can look at it and see it's all approaching the same problem from a slightly different angle. Yeah. But it's sort of having that experience of working for those different organizations sort of is quite insightful.
Yeah, and you've made some really great points there. It's so, especially as a UK citizen, it's so easy to get caught up in these exotic species that are, from far off lands. But like you say, we are very nature depleted, and it almost, in a sense, then makes those interactions like seeing a barn owl that much more special. And yeah, some of our wild habitats in the UK are really stunning to look at.
It is such a beautiful country. We have this, beautiful green, diverse country. We used to have sort of coastal rainforests and obviously temperate rainforests, but there's very little of that left. And the first time I saw a badger, I was absolutely a live badger, which seems to be quite rare these days, but sort of sitting there and saw this badger sort of potter out of its hole at dusk, and it took my breath away. It's one of those things that you just go, there's badger from Wind in the Willows. Or and seeing that barn owl just drop from a tree in front of me and just absolutely silently glide through this sort of glade in the forest, and again it just stopped me in my tracks. And it's amazing talking to sort of a number of colleagues that some of them are sort of saying to me, I've never seen a live hedgehog. And it's like wow. That's sad. That's again, it's some of our really iconic wildlife, and people haven't seen it, they've not experienced it, they've not potted along a hedgerow and sort of had a deer suddenly pop their head up from a copse ahead of them, or they can be really magical experiences and quite unexpected encounters sometimes. And I think that, again, the potential for habitat restoration in the UK is huge. And sometimes it's a simple thing of letting your grass grow and popping in a couple of blackthorn bushes in your garden to help feed the birds. But there's something we can all do in our everyday lives to sort of help wildlife, whether it's, on our doorstep or sometimes a little bit further away. But we have more personal, I don't say power, that's the wrong word I'm thinking of, but we have an ability to act, and I think sometimes we forget it. But there's a lot we can do without it, being too big of an impact on our own lives, but it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And kind of the one thing that I'm learning through, various conversations with different people on the podcast is that being, looking after habitat in your own home, even as a little act, but if this is something that you're potentially considering as a career, starting in the UK can have a gateway to those far off lands, should that be your initial goal. But
Yeah, I think it can, but I think also, the day I stood on the edge of the Ngorongoro crater, I was like a little 5-year-old schoolgirl, sort of jumping up and down, going, "Oh my God, I've dreamed about being here since, I don't know how long." And it was a truly magical moment. But as I've sort of progressed in my career, I think I value more and more what's on my doorstep more. And because it's what you see every day, it's what you experience every day of your life. And yes, we can use sort of, building those transferable skills in UK conservation can absolutely be transferred to projects sort of worldwide. But also you might start to realize just how big of an impact you can have.
Yeah.
And, I spent most of my, 3 months field work in Tanzania catching frogs as part of the biodiversity survey. I know an awful lot about frogs now. Those sort of larger encounters that people imagine don't happen so much. And when they do, they can be quite intimidating. When you're sort of doing a survey, looking at, trees and tree use and what frogs have you caught today? And you look up and you realize that, you're being stared down by a baboon, or you hear an elephant crashing through the woods in the distance, and you just go, "Oh, I'm quite exposed here." But it's exciting, but it's quite intimidating too.
Yeah, I'd definitely be intimidated by a baboon.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, they don't seem to be terribly intimidated by us.
No, I can imagine. So, in your opinion, then, what is the biggest challenge facing conservation?
I think personally it is a feeling of powerlessness amongst the wider populace. A lot of people really care. We can see how popular David Attenborough's documentaries are. People are inspired by nature. We know that our well-being increases when we spend time in nature. We know that well-being even occurs if we're just watching birds out of our window. But being connected to nature in some way, improves our well-being, it improves our mental health, it improves our physical health. So we know it's a really good thing, but a lot of people are very disconnected. And I think trying to reconnect people to nature, even if it is just once a week, walk through a, small wood or country lane. It's difficult if you're in cities because, everybody benefits from access to nature, but, being able to have that contact, whether it's city parks or whatever, or as I said, feeding birds out your window, it can have a huge impact on us. And the feeling that each and every one of us can do something. I think the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis are overwhelming. It causes a lot of anxiety. I feel it too. There are times I feel completely overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge, and it freezes you. It's, you think, well, what can I do in the face of this? And actually we can, each and every one of us can do a little bit. But when all those little bits come together, we can do something amazing. And I think people have lost faith in that. They've lost the ability to recognize that they have agency in their own lives and the agency to affect the world around them as well. So I think connecting people with nature, and making sure that people have roots where they can take the action if they want to. And that, if we can overcome those hurdles, I think we could see a real tipping point in the way that we treat the world in which we live. And that is probably one of the most influential things that can happen.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point to finish up on there. So just before we end up the conversation today, Tania, we're just going to finish on a light-hearted note and some quick fire fun questions just to learn a bit more about what makes you tick. So obviously, yeah, you've got this passion for conservation and nature and environments, but are there any dream species that you'd love to see in the wild?
Oh, I spent 4 months in lion country and I never saw one. I heard them outside the camp within a couple of meters when I was doing fire watch at 4 a.m, keeping the fire going to keep the lions away. Heard one just outside the firelight. Never saw one. 4 months. 4 months. Never set eyes on one. So part of me feels that I need to rebalance that.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Some vindication there.
But I have to admit as well, my favourite bird species is a peregrine falcon, and I've
Amazing.
never seen a peregrine falcon in life. So I'd very much like to see one of those as well.
Yeah, blink. They're blinking. You miss them, aren't they?
Yeah.
I went a couple of years ago. Went up to was it Broadmoor National Park, somewhere where there was the RSPB site, Bempton Cliffs. That was it,
Right.
where the albatross is residential. And we was obviously all looking out over the sea, see if this albatross was going to appear. And someone else behind us shouted, "Peregrine!" And yep, turn round, it's gone. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, but yeah, hope that great species would love for you to see them.
Yeah, no, I think they occasionally nest on the cathedral tower in Winchester. So I
Hmm.
might just have to go and stake out Winchester. It's not that far away from Marwell. So but yes, might be able to see them flying back in.
Fantastic. And countries or continents then obviously you've expressed that love for Africa early doors as a result of kind of watching documentaries and now fast forward spending time out there. Is there anyone else anywhere else that you'd love to kind of visit or spend an extended amount of time?
I I would love to go to New Zealand. I've never been. A lot of it is to do with their conservation work,
Yes.
that they have been so innovative in addressing some of the challenges that they face. Um, so yeah, I'd love to visit New Zealand particularly, but to be honest, I go places and almost everywhere sort of surprises and delights me. That I went to Tallinn, so in Estonia, a little while ago, and thought, oh, while I'm there, I'll just, I've never seen brown bears. I'll go on one of these bear watching overnight things in the forest in a hide. It was amazing. I mean, we saw raccoon dogs
Oh,
first of all, and I honestly I would have been happy with those. I was something I'd just never seen before. But yeah, no, spent and saw then all these bears came in, and it was amazing. So if somebody had asked me for a bucket list as a kid, I probably wouldn't have put Estonia on it, but it's
yeah.
beautiful. It's absolutely stunning, and the people are wonderful. Um, and I pretty much find that everywhere I go, that there is always something magical and exciting. And um, so no, I could probably sort of list every single country in the
Yeah.
world. Because everywhere you go, there is phenomenal landscapes and countryside and wildlife. And but yeah, New Zealand's definitely on my hit list as well.
No, yeah, that's very poignant, I suppose, in a sense. Yeah, that everything everywhere's got something to offer, and so
Mm.
having no expectations is by all some respect the best mindset to have.
I think if you're prepared to open your eyes and look around you, everywhere you go has got something amazing to offer.
Yeah, yeah, great point. So I suppose if we're obviously talking about conservation and what's good conservation, but if there was one species from around the world that could be native to the UK with no negative effects
Oh,
on the biodiversity, because yeah, we're obviously advocating for not doing things that are impacting conservation, what would it be?
I I love a snow leopard. Now, that wouldn't go down well.
No.
And actually, my boss at the zoo has worked quite extensively with snow leopards in China and Kazakhstan, and but they are just as a child, it's one of my favorites, and they're stunning.
Yeah.
They, there's not a long history of them attacking people. I think we could, yeah, I don't know how much they'd like it, but and there's no blue sheep or ibex to chase
No.
down mountains, and um, but yeah, yeah would be very happy to see a snow leopard pattering around the countryside as long as there was no negative effects on.
Yeah.
But you can't introduce a large carnivore and not have any. But
Right. Yeah. Hypothetically though, in
a
a world.
hypothetical vegetarian snow leopard.
So how when you know because conservation is very much a full-time role and like I say it's never done, you'd never walk away from it, but when you're kind of unwinding and relaxing, how do you keep busy?
I'm a bit of a history nerd, and anything weird from history I love. Like medieval bestiaries. This is kind of connected, but it's how people used to view animals in the
Mhm.
past, and some of the drawings or
Yeah.
the illuminations in them where somebody has clearly never ever seen the animal in their life, but it's been described to them. So sort of the medieval marginalia and the bestiaries I love, but just weird history as well. Like, give me a good ghost story.
Yeah.
Love a ghost tour somewhere, and but yes, I think it's just trying to switch off can be quite hard.
Hmm.
It's always, I'll just finish this, I'll just do that, and um but yeah, I am a bit of a history, and then the dog drags me out, and so get a bit of fresh air and things that way as well. But yeah.
There is a great book actually. You may have already heard of it already. It's called Penguins, Pineapples, and Pangolins.
Oh,
It's not a big book, but it's a compendium of kind of explorers' first notes of when they first come across
brilliant.
animals and specific fruits and places, and yeah. So yeah, that might be one that you'd enjoy.
Yeah, no, definitely, it sounds great.
And how can everyone get involved with Scimitar Horned Oryx conservation, even if they're not involved in conservation?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say if people can become directly involved. I mean, certainly, anyone who visits Marwell helps support our conservation work. So everyone through the gate is making a contribution, whether they know it or not. Um, I think the sort of biggest thing people can do is just to get involved in conservation somehow. As I said, even if it's growing bee and butterfly friendly plants in their garden. And I think things ripple out. We don't always recognize, those ripples in the pond as they move outwards. But when we start sort of connecting a bit more with nature and caring a little bit more about nature and recognizing its value to us, then we start acting in a way that supports it and creates space for it. And as I said, that can ripple out. So as people get involved directly in scimitar conservation, it's difficult. It's a North African species, but certainly, supporting places where they have been reintroduced to. So, if somebody was going to Tunisia and they wanted to
Hmm.
see them, they're in 4 protected areas there. The same for Morocco. You can see them in Souss National Park, so it's not far from Agadir. Um, so there are places where you can go and see them, and by going to see them you create interest in the species, and it's more likely to receive conservation attention then as well. But certainly, as I said, anyone who visits Marwell helps support their conservation, and there are a number of other zoos which have been working for a long time on their conservation, but also help support Marwell in the work that we do. um, so again, visiting those institutions, Dublin Zoo in Ireland, and others, have been long-term supporters. So yeah, and you can go onto our website and find out more information as well.
Fantastic. And last point then, what do you think, if there is just one thing that our listeners should take away from today's episode?
That you have agency in making a difference to nature, that there is hope, recovery of nature is possible, and we can make, even small steps can make a difference. So sort of going away, I'm going to do something in my own garden or in my own area, or I'm going to sign up to be a volunteer for a wildlife trust, but we have agency, we can make a difference. It sometimes feels hopeless, but it's not. So hang on to that hope, and even the little things can make a big difference.
With that, Tanya, you've rounded off our conversation very nicely. So a massive shout out to you for gracing the podcast with your knowledge and passion. Clearly not just for Scimitar Horned Oryx, but yeah, global conservation and positive attitudes towards what can happen. So we'll be sure to keep up with all of the work of Marwell and specifically, the future of Scimitar Horned Oryxes, and yeah, wish you the best with your career moving forward.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And there it is, folks. Another episode of the Conservationists Assemble podcast has come to an end. I thoroughly enjoyed having Tania on the podcast, displaying her wisdom and passion and positive attitude towards conservation. Thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in as always. If you've got a spare minute to like, share, review and rate the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated, as this helps the podcast to get discovered and spread the word of the amazing work happening in conservation around the world. Your opinions and stories are important to me, so please do give the podcast a follow on Facebook or Instagram and interact with us. I'd love to hear from you. Be sure to keep your eyes and ears out for more awesome stories coming soon.